Good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock in Amsterdam and in Bremen, but who knows where other people are in the world. It's a pleasure to be here in Amsterdam today for another Hot Politics meeting. We're approaching the summer. It's really nice out, but I'm happy you are here today. And I'm also really happy and honored that we have Professor Arvid Kappas from Jacobs University visiting us today, because he is really a renowned expert in the psychology of emotions. Has a PhD from Dartmouth, worked at various places across the world, and has really been leading some of our thinking of how we should conceptualize emotions. And therefore, really pleased that you were willing to meet with us today in this hybrid environment. So without further ado, the floor is yours, and afterwards there's plenty of time to discuss with Professor Kappas his talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Let me see whether that works. Okay, you should see the slide now. Does that work? I cannot hear anybody.
It works.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for giving me this chance. I am very excited to talk about emotions today in the context of your Hot Politics group, because I think that it's one thing to talk about emotions, and it's another thing to talk about emotions and what they do. And I decided to start in a very basic manner, and I hope that it is not too basic, given that most of the people in the talk are working actively with emotions, but then we can, in the Q&A, surely go a little bit further. I decided to call this talk "Oh, Emotion You Wondrous Thing" because emotions are something that is very close to our hearts, pun intended, but it is also something that is very difficult to grasp. But despite the fact that it is so difficult to grasp, there is an understanding that emotions play a much larger role in many questions and many disciplines. And so I start with a paper that came out last year, The Rise of Effectivism, which was published in Nature Human Behavior, and which has a long list of authors. I'm one of them. And the goal of the paper is to show, well, if you look at the role that emotions play in trying to understand human behavior, it becomes obvious that something happened in the last few years. So we all know that about 100 years ago, the predominant paradigm in psychology was behaviorism. In the 70s, there was a sort of cognitive wave that swept behaviorism apparently under the rug, only to find out that the way that cognition was thought of at the time doesn't work that well, and some aspects of what behaviorists would talk about would actually be quite relevant. And then affect sort of came into being, and this is due to historical things like research by Paul Ekman, for example, in the late 60s, and many other things, but perhaps Damasio's publications that sort of made very powerfully the point that emotions play a key factor in making decisions, and people who have difficulties in linking to their emotions because of neurological problems have difficulties making decisions. So that basically we have these three columns where we think that maybe there is something like an effectivism wave right now. There are data that one can look at where you would say in the last 20 years, the funding for emotion research increased. But you see it also when you look at the content in various fields like behavior research, where there's an increase, attention research, decision-making, I already said. And it's very often not a linear thing, but that there is a point there and then a more steeper incline. Now, the idea in that paper is not that emotion explains everything, but that we should come to a point where emotion, motivation, and cognition are seen together, and none of them should be neglected in trying to understand why people do what they do, how people differ in what they do, effects, origins, all of these things should have emotions somewhere in there. Now, it turns out to be a challenge, of course. Given that you work on emotions, you know that very well. If you talk to anybody at home, at a party, everybody knows what emotions are and seems to recognize them. But the funny thing is, if you talk to people who talk specifically about emotions, they seem to be talking about a completely different thing. So this picture from Time magazine sort of symbolizes, I guess, something about love. Well, most emotion theorists would not even count love as one of their emotions. So maybe they are very different people. And when you go into not stage images, but you go into the real world and you look at what happens there, it seems to be very complex. The same situation causes different reactions in different people. Sometimes big things don't seem to be cause much. Sometimes little things make people very emotional. So what's the problem? One of the jokes in emotion research, and it's like an in-joke, I mean, it's probably not extremely funny, is that people who work on emotions cannot agree on a definition what emotion actually is, despite the fact that the public seems to know what it is. So there was an important paper which was published in 1981, a categorized list of emotion definitions with suggestions for a consensual definition, which was in motivation and emotion, where Klein-Ginner and Klein-Ginner went into textbooks and various sources to see how people defined emotions, and rather than finding cohesion, they found among their list of 92 definitions that they sourced and 9 what they considered skeptical statements, they basically identified 11 categories of definitions where different authors would say, well, emotions are particularly about, for example, expression or the adaptive function or very different ways. Of course, some of them would talk about multiple of these aspects, but it was a little bit of Babylonian confusion. And so they said, well, we try to synthesize somehow what a consensus thing could be. And so they come up with a consensus working model as, and let me read this. Emotion is a complex set of interactions among subjective and objective factors mediated by neural hormonal systems, which can A, give rise to affective experiences such as feelings of arousal, pleasure, displeasure, B, generate cognitive processes such as emotionally relevant perceptual effects, appraisals, labeling processes, C, activate widespread physiological adjustments to the arousing conditions, and D, lead to behavior that is often but not always expressive, goal-directed, and adaptive. That's terrible. I mean, this describes the world. You cannot use a definition like that to, for example, build a meaningful model, to make a machine that would be emotional or explain why a human does what it is that they do. So by and large, I had hoped at that point that this whole business with the confusion of these different theories is basically not true. That essentially people believe the same thing, but for the case of argument, for making a particular argument in a paper, they would emphasize a particular thing like the adaptive value or something. But if you would pin people down and you say, okay, imagine this and that happens and you perceive it and blah, 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 that people must agree somehow how this works. But it turns out that is not so. One of the institutions that organize emotion researchers is the International Society for Research on Emotion, ISRI, of which I'm a member since many years. And I remember that in 2007, they published an issue of their newsletter called The Definition Issue, cute play with words, where different members would state what they think emotions were. And it was all over the place. It really went in all directions. Then 2010, Carol Izzard, one of the big names in emotion research, published a paper, The Many Meanings Aspects of Emotion, Definitions, Functions, Activation, and Regulation, which was published in the then very new Emotion Review. What Carol did was that he approached the key people, the big ones, the people who had shaped the field, to were fellows of many societies and so forth, and asked them specific questions such as what is an emotion, what is the primary function of emotion, what activates an emotion, how is emotion most effectively regulated, are there rapid, automatic, and unconscious connections amongst emotion, cognition, and action? And what is another question that we should raise for research and discussion? And the list includes a member of the National Academy of Sciences, winners of the APA Award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution, past presidents of APS, etc., etc. So what do they do? Do they agree? No, they don't. So they also have some agreement like, yeah, there seem to be neural systems that somehow play a role. But when it comes to things like appraisal or so forth, the role of feelings, feeling state, it already starts to fizzle away. And so if you go and read that paper, one sees that there was still quite some diversity in what people say. So I took away from that we should not get stuck in this definition issue, because this is probably true for many fields. I would assume, being naive to that myself, I'm not a political scientist, but if you take concepts like what is politics, or concepts like democracy or whatever, there's a lot of disagreement. And somehow emotion researchers seem to have developed a fetish to celebrate the diversity there. But in fact, that doesn't hinder to do emotion research. So just for completion, what do I think about this? Here's an abstract from a paper, which is a few years old. Emotion and regulation are one. And let me read this. Emotions are foremost self-regulating processes that permit rapid responses and adaptations to situations of personal concern. They have biological bases and are shaped ontogenetically via learning and experience. Many situations and events of personal concern are social in nature. Thus, social exchanges play an important role in learning about rules and norms that shape regulation processes. I argue that emotions often are actively auto-regulating. B, certain emotion components are likely to habituate dynamically. C, emotions are typically intra- and interpersonal processes. And D, emotions are not just regulated, they regulate. Now, I seem to complain about the Klein-Ginner and Klein-Ginner definition. This is not much better. It's also a lot of things, but just for completion, what I would think. Okay, so I had a look what you guys do. And so from your website, it says, it is often claimed that politics is deeply emotional and increasingly so. politicians seem to make more and more extreme emotional appeals than ever before. Citizens are angered about politics or anxious about political developments. Sometimes they're deeply enthusiastic and hopeful about political candidates or political change. Still, there are many questions about the role of emotions in politics. How fundamental are they? When do they emerge? And are there differences between people in the emotions they experience? And so if I look at how does that map to somebody who would come from an emotion theory backdrop, it is what are the effects of emotions, what causes them, the inter-individual differences in emotions, and the relationship between different components of different emotional responses, because you state later that when you ask people or you look at behavior and you take physiological responses, there doesn't seem to be a relation between these two variables. So what does more modern emotion theory say or research say about that? So when I say modern, I mean 1960. And I got stuck with appraisal theory and Magda Arnold because in the big picture, there was a lot of interest before 1960, but somehow people seem to be fascinated with questions like, what is the sequence? Does the feeling trigger the physiology, or does the physiology trigger the feeling? But not where does that come from. William James thought that there's a direct connection somewhere in the brain, that when you see a bear that you run. That obviously cannot be. And so it was appraisal theory that made the point that there must be an evaluation, that there must be a matching process that somehow maps bear to some behavior. And in the cognitive revolution, this type of thought was thought of as a thought in the sense of the little voice in your head. But that is not what Magda Arnold, who's surely the mother of appraisal, talked about. She said appraisal is the direct, immediate sense judgment of weal or woe, and appraisals are direct, immediate, non-reflective, non-intellectual, and automatic judgments about the meaning of events. What that might mean in the context of a politician is that you might not see a particular politician and say, oh, this is Trump, and I don't like him because of this or that, but that at that stage, there are a variety of automatic processes which may or may not be always available to the person. Arnold said, to perceive or apprehend something means that I know what it is like as a thing apart from any effect of me. To like or dislike it, that is to perceive it emotionally, means that I know it not only objectively as it is apart from me, but also that I estimate its relation to me, that I appraise it as desirable or undesirable, valuable or harmful for me, so that I'm drawn toward it or repelled by it. So this means that, for example, being a racist does not just mean that somebody states something, but that there are motivational processes which cause particular changes in behavior or so that they might not even be aware of. The consequence of that is, as you know, because you are using, for example, physiological measures, that just asking people about stuff does not work that well. So when it comes to appraisal, of course, there are various names. This is one version of a highly subjective family tree. So if Magda Arnold is the mama of appraisal, Lazarus is the papa, and he did already in 1964 cool stuff that many of you will know, but not all. Here, for example, you see skin conductance while people are watching a movie. The movie itself is a very difficult movie. It's an anthropological thing where bloody ceremony, which resembles a circumcision, is shown. where a young man is being circumcised, and due to this becomes part of the community of adults. And you can see here is an arrow, start of the film, and then time in 15-second intervals. And you see that there are various bumps in these lines that you see. Here, this is when the first operation is seen, a second operation, a third operation, but you see that these three lines have different levels. Well, they relate to different conditions. So the top line is when people just watched the movie not knowing anything about it. The second one is when there was a text that focused on the meaning of this for the young man and not the pain. So it's a positive thing, and they've been looking forward to that for a long, long time. And the denial orientation is particularly cool because there, the talking was before, whatever happened was framed in a particular way, and then watching it did not lead to the same level of responses. This was the first demonstration that thinking about an object in a particular way changes the way how your body responds to it. And it's a very elegant demonstration that to understand emotional processes, particularly ongoing processes, physiology, can be a very interesting thing. Now, I don't have that much time today, so I will not get into the whole Lazarus science debate, but I'm happy to, if there are questions. Basically, science criticized Lazarus and said, you're talking rubbish. There's so much that is going on that is automatic, that what you say, how people think about it is completely irrelevant. And the fun thing is that what science did basically was that he pointed out facts that Magda Arnold had said a few years before about appraisals, that they are particularly automatic, immediate, and that fits all very well. But in some people's mind, this has stuck as appraisal theory has been shown to be wrong or irrelevant. And I recall when I had the job interview at Jacobs University, and somebody in the committee said the equivalent of, you seem like a nice and intelligent fellow. How can you believe in this appraisal stuff when science has shown that it cannot be so? And yes, you find people like that everywhere. So here's, for example, from Annual Review of Political Science, from G. Marcus, a statement and an article, Emotion in Politics. Affective processing became more prominent in psychology, beginning with the seminal work of science as a psychologist. The idea that emotional processes occur outside of conscious awareness, which was initially treated with skepticism, is no longer disputed. Now, apart from the fact that the Freuds of this world started to talk 100 years earlier about processes outside conscious awareness, this is simply not true. This is simply a misreading that was not helpful. And so people were discussing a lot the forth and back of automatic processes and conscious processes relating to emotion. And in my mind, the best way to approach this is a variant of Scherer's theory that is a more differentiated appraisal theory than Lazarus, for example, by having more dimensions. But he proposed at some point, together with Howard Leventhal, the idea that appraisals can simply happen at different levels, so that there are automatic appraisals and that there are conscious appraisals, and they both have access to pathways like physiological changes, subjective experience, and so forth. So if I see a spider, I'm a little bit spider phobic, So I know that the thing cannot do me anything bad. And I look at it and I can say, yeah, it's harmless, but my heartbeat will go up because there is a schema of spider that I cannot get out of my brain unless I do some nice therapy, probably. And you can say you want to do a diet, and you look at a piece of cake, and you know this is evil because you cannot eat it, you cannot have it. But at the same time, your body says, yes. And your saliva collects and whatnot. And in my mind, that dual level, and Sharon and Leventhal actually even talked about 3, is one of the most interesting aspects to think about what happens when different dependent variables don't agree, when you have self-report going in one direction and physiology in another. There are other reasons for that, but that I don't want to go into. Here I have a recent paper that I found, a systems view of emotion in socio-political context, that I thought was interesting. And basically, they say, I will read the abstract, will be easier. Most work to date in psychology and related sciences has examined simple unidirectional causal processes of emotion affecting socio-political context or vice versa. In this classic mechanistic view of science, each empirical observation stands on its own as a piece of some grander, not yet understandable puzzle of nature. There have been repeated calls to eschew classic approaches in favor of systems meta theory in psychology and related sciences. In this paper, we join these calls by arguing that systems meta theory can better enable the study of emotions in socio-political contexts. We offer a brief primer on systems meta theory, delineating 3 key beneficial features: multi-leveled, complex, and dynamic, viewing emotion as a system of systems within the person, their relationship to others, and within the world locally and globally, enables fresh theory methods and statistical analysis well suited to the study of emotion in socio-political context. Some of what they say resonates with what I'm thinking. They talk a lot about the important role of appraisal. Modern appraisal theories such as Scherer and colleagues address not only the question how emotions come about, but also that is me who says that in individual differences, and that relates as well to the issue of the coherence of different affective components. So what I'm doing, just to mention this, is indeed I'm interested in bodily responses to emotions and use that in context. So here's, for example, a paper called The Dynamics of Emotions in Online Interaction, which was part of an EU project called Cyber Emotions, where David Garcia and Frank Schweitzer were key in providing a model for how emotions develop and spread over the network, and basically model a very simple model with computational agent modeling that says you read stuff and that makes you annoyed, that creates arousal. And when you have the chance to respond to it, the arousal goes down. And then you can model how these things cascade. I really super simplify this paper. But what we then did was that we developed the lab paradigm that goes with the model, so that we could demonstrate indeed that when people would read contents, and we had pre-tested that all, that would cause physiological responses. And if we would give them the chance to respond, that it would go down. And then you can simply model that if then 10 people see this and the probability is this and that, and then 3 of them will get to the trigger point where they write and so forth, and you can model such cascades. And as the last thing, something that relates a bit to topics that you are particularly interested is together with Ekaterina Litkina, who does the PhD with me, and I think who's also here today, who's looking into the role of emotions and as an underneath factor appraisals to changes in adopting or holding populist attitudes. And I just have this slide as a placeholder for the type of things that she studies. And I encourage you to invite her. I'm sure she's keen to talk about that research, but we today don't have time. She has done quite a few studies where we look particularly in the UK at stances that people hold with a vignette approach. But again, I won't go into this. My interests these days go in various directions. The slide here not only has my email in case you want to contact me, but also shows a group of young people and a robot. Next week is the closing event of a project called Animatas, which was a training network for 15 young engineers, young scientists who want to use robots for education. And my interest in there is trying to understand emotion well enough that you can put some of that knowledge into artificial intelligence systems and robots so that they can understand humans better, interact better, and play a better role in education. And with that, I think I'm time-wise at the point where I should be. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Arvid, for this very nice presentation. And I'm wondering if we can use that robot in politics as well. But that
well, there are already some.
Yeah, okay, yeah, but they're supposedly human. So for the people new here today, I'm Gijs Schumacher, co-hosting this together with Bert Bakker. And you can, if you have questions for Arvid, you can type them into the Q&A box. At least that is for the people online. The people here offline with me today, that of course is to gently signal me that they have a question. What? No, this is over. That's fixed.
Okay, let me ask a question while you think.
Yeah.
Who in the room is familiar with appraisal theory?
I think everyone.
Good.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
now they are, of course.
I hope it wasn't too basic then, yes.
But there's a question here from the audience.
I'm going to start this with a very, very general question, which I tend to ask to all fellow researchers who work with emotions and emotion regulation and cognition more generally. So since 2010 that I started working and reading through this literature, I have a really big difficulty in telling apart what is emotion and what is cognition, where the boundary lies between those two constructs. So I know this is a very, very hard question to answer, but I just like to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay. I am not by nature a social constructivist, but I think that merits a constructivist answer. The terms that we use, like cognition, emotion, or motivation, are categories that we use which do not have specific boundaries, but which are buckets that help us to understand a variety of things. Lisa Feldman Barrett says somewhere that emotions are not natural kinds, and emotions and cognitions are not natural kinds. It is not something that is completely separable. So I would say that these are categories that we use to describe a variety of phenomena, but that in of themselves can also be useless. I mean, people who are critical, like Alan Fridland, have said, you know, that whole emotion concept is useless to explain facial behavior. And I got really very upset with that. But in a way, why do you need to know what cognition and emotion is? What is the consequence of your definition for what you want to do and for what you want to understand? So this is a stance that you should take to see whether it makes a difference. So let's say that you are interested in how a political statement by a leader causes particular responses in people who are fans or enemies of that person. You know who that person is. You are able to identify people in favor or not. The statements, yeah, you can create them and you can measure what happens. But the moment that you start to say, well, they have to understand the statement and then they have to take the emotional content and this and that, the definition of the object in my mind sometimes can be more causing problems than not. In my mind, it is very difficult to assume human emotions which are completely independent of cognitions. And there are few cognitive processes that are not or that cannot be affected by emotions. If you say cognitive processes are memories, attention, thought, all of these interact with emotions. And the interaction means that there's not a boundary between them, but they are sort of intermingled. If you look in the brain and you have an area like in prefrontal cortex or whatever, where you can map where more cognitive processes like trying to regulate something and more effective things like the responses to images that you look at, where they meet, of course that overlaps. You cannot separate it completely. Now that's a lot of talk on my side that probably wasn't very helpful, but that at least is my thoughts about that.
All right, thank you so much.
Bert has a question.
Yeah, I'm actually curious, given the different perspectives and the overview you've given, how have you come to inform things like the robot project to say, well, this is then what we know of emotion, and now we can feed an algorithm some knowledge given the disagreement and differences. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit how you?
Yeah. So I hope there are not too many engineers in the group today, but but the engineers seem to like simple explanations. So they go to the library, physical or the internet, they Google or they ask for a book on emotions, and there's a chapter on Paul Ekman, and it says there are 6 basic emotions and this is what they look like. And they say, oh, okay, I can do that. And my point then would be to say, yeah, well, you know, this is nice and useful, but, and then show that there might be more emotions, that the problem is already how do you define what a basic emotion is and all of that. You look at post and spontaneous expressions and all of that, and it starts to get very messy. However, if you take a step back And you would say, well, emotions are to a large degree about things going well or not going well, positive and negative. That seems to be not so satisfying as to make the distinction between anger and fear for that moment. But I am pretty confident that I can tell a machine to get a sense of it goes well or it doesn't go well. So if I have a robot that is supposed to help a child while learning something, I don't want to mess with boredom and sadness and what have you. If the machine already knows things are going well and can feed more tasks, or things are not going well and you can slow down and ask a question, the system is already better, because I do not need to try to build a real human. I just try to make the actions of the machine better, more fit to interacting with humans, and I steal these ideas from our understanding of emotions. If I wanted to build a clone, yes, we're not at that stage, by far not at that stage. And those people who work in artificial intelligence, they say, you know, you guys, you are all boring. We just take some cameras and some microphones, and we have some really big networks, and we just let it record, and eventually a human will come out, and it will talk like a human and walk like a human and behave like a human. And yeah, well, then you have built a human, and maybe that works if you could build such a complex machine, but then you wouldn't understand a thing. You would have just simulated what biology does anyway. So that is not helpful either. We still have to believe somehow that the analysis that we do as scientists helps to simplify complexity to a point that we can use it as a tool for our particular purposes, such as a particular application.
Thanks a lot, Arvid. There's a question here online from someone with the beautiful name Anonymous attendee. Thank you so much for your interesting talk. You mentioned that from Shearer's point of view, there are different levels of appraisals taking place. Some might be automatic, some more controlled. This reminded me of the dual system theories of cognition,
Yes.
which also assume that cognition can happen in two ways, easy automatic or more deliberate controlled analytic. I was wondering if you see a connection between Shearer's appraisal theory and dual systems theories of cognition.
Yes, not the appraisal theory as such, but there is a paper by, and let me, I put it in the chat, Leventhal and Scherer, 1987. You will find that it was in the first issue of Cognition and Emotion, where this multi-level version is explained. And Howard Leventhal is somebody who worked before, among other things, on how we process pain. And there is a multiple level thing going on. And these dual level theories, and that they all come from the same universe of how thinking about it. But the big challenge is that no theory that I know of convincingly makes the point how those two levels interact in the end. There are some people who believe that the function of feelings, and many people have never thought about that, what is the function of feelings in that sense, is that your brain is able to process a huge complexity, but it cannot talk to you. The shortcut to that is how something feels. So there is a dark alley. You know you don't have much time. The train is going soon. That dark alley might lead to the train station, and it could mean you could get the train. If you take the long way, you probably miss the train. should you take that dark alley? And you look at it and it feels bad. You feel uneasy about it. What that is, in that way of thinking, is a shortcut to lots of processes that have computed that bad things can happen there. And they tell this to you in an easy to digest message. And in my mind, it is this, how these two levels interact, that is one of the great challenges in psychology. It is one of the great challenges that you have identified in your own work about divergence of, for example, physiological or other behavior and what people say, and for people who want to build artificial humans as well.
Thanks a lot. I actually just wanted to ask you for some more information on particularly this question, because you mentioned at one point this divergence between physiology and self-reports of emotions, and I think there was a bit more you wanted to say there. So maybe you can continue on that theme.
Okay, so the first thing is that physiology is not there to entertain scientists. Physiology is there to serve particular bodily functions, and it's busy doing that all the time. Your heart is happily doing all kinds of things so that you can breathe and think and so forth. And there are modifications to that that are linked to some processes that we are interested in. And a big challenge is to pick a particular parameter and link it to a specific process of psychological meaning. And there are some wonderful papers by Cacioppo, or particularly in the combination of Cacioppo and Tessenary, on psychophysiological inference. And I love that. I truly love it, because it is not only relevant to the peripheral physiological measures that they talk about, or central physiological processes like brain activity that share some elements. No, it's true for everything that we measure that is indirect and that we want to get out of it. And this is what is the relationship between these two levels. And in most cases, there's not a one-to-one relationship. So right now, everybody is still worried about the pandemic. So people take temperature, and so you have a rise in temperature. Does that mean that you have corona? Well, maybe, or maybe not, because there are many things that can raise your temperature. There's a many-to-one relationship between what causes that particular change. The challenge is to find combinations of measures that would lead to a one-to-one relationship of what the physiological signal is and the psychological process that you're after. And this is made more complicated by the fact that we are wired slightly differently. Because of our genetic and because of genetic bodily makeup. So for example, if we would take, oh God, what a horrible thought. I've seen Stranger Things the other day, so I'm a little biased.
Me too.
Let's assume that we would take each of your hearts out and put them on the table. They all would look differently, because muscles and organs have considerable differences. The wiring is a little bit different. Things like the big zygomatic muscle that is connected from the corner of the mouth to here, and that is involved in smiling, not only is slightly differently connected in different people, for some people it's not even there, and the action is simulated by other muscles. So you have this model, how these two things relate, but they might differ from person to person because of their makeup. And then it relates to things that they have learned during their lifetime, like with the heart rate example, how sporty they are, how much they eat, fatty stuff, and so forth. So there are many things that cause noise. So one way of doing that would be a big data approach. You simply take a zillion people and run the study with a zillion people, but you only have money, time, and subjects to run 30. And so you run 30, but it's not enough. It's not enough. If one thing has shown us about the replicability crisis in psychology is that for convenience sake, we have used underpowered studies for these things. We have way too few replications where different labs try to do the same thing as we should. I mean, we should have groups of labs that collaborate and do similar stuff and see how that works. But we don't, for practical reasons. You cannot publish that easily. Nobody wants to publish a study from 10 labs on something that seems to be relatively trivial. And all the people in there who need the publications for strategic purposes, they need the publications. So we're a little bit stuck in a system where we know that the stats don't work, but we still try to do it. And so many of us have found to work more with online studies due to the pandemic. Some have done that before, and there you can get the big numbers. The problem is, then you have the numbers, but you're not really looking at what you wanted to look at the very beginning. So for example, doing physiological studies online, not a trivial task.
Okay, great.
Could I ask you that for?
Yeah, but we have a few more minutes.
No, first question. Yeah, do that first. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We'll have a question from Yula Luring. Thanks for the talk. Super interesting. What do you think is the role of emotions in the context of misinformation, susceptibility, spreading? And she writes, the more I research this question, the less I feel I know. That's a familiar feeling, but.
Yeah, it's really strange. I must say that this misinformation stuff has baffled me. If some of you are the way that I am, you might have thought about, if you had a time machine, which period would you go? What would be of interest? And one of the phenomena that always fascinated me was medieval ages. The way that it is portrayed in the media and books, it is possible that somebody comes to a village and says, behold, I have just killed a dragon out there beyond that mountain. Oh, this is wonderful. Where is it? Well, it exploded the moment I killed it, so you cannot see it anymore. And then people say, yay, we have a dragon slayer, and they celebrate him because it seemed in medieval times it was possible to claim completely outlandish things, and people would somehow accept that, which, you know, you can do also with children. They will accept that. And I thought we are beyond this. And the last few years have demonstrated that we are not. And maybe the cynical view would be that this enlightenment thing maybe was a little bit illusionary after all, and we're still a little bit in that medieval time. Now, if you are in such a context where you don't think that you have to be critical, challenge statements, but just feel fuzzy and warm if stories are reinforced on the one hand, or if the story is that you have the basic view on life that there are people out there to screw you. You are a poor wheel in the big machine, and there are all these people out who want to screw you. and then somebody comes and brings some misinformation that underscores that, you don't need to think about whether it's true or wrong. It emphasizes that you are right in your basic belief about the world, and it probably has a positive and reinforcing function. Yes, you get angry, perhaps, but then anger can also be seen as a positive emotion, as some researchers and Klingons would say. So this misinformation thing, I think it's better to take a step back and not think of it as false information, but the function that it serves for the person who receives that. I think that would be an important frame. And maybe people are doing that, and I just don't know, because it's not my field, sorry.
Arvid, I have a short question. We have only 2-3 minutes left, but what if a lot of the work is based on small samples and underpowered? What do we then know about emotion, and in particular the psychophysiological or the sort of the more lab-based paradigms? Like, how robust do you think these are, or should we first investigate these before we start building on them?
Well, I started with this effectivism thing, and that had some images of research and funding increasing. Mm-hmm. I think what it means is that many people have realized we should take emotions not only as that fluff that is non-serious, but that it might be a serious contributor to the phenomenon that I'm interested in. But the reason why I go more and more back to classical theories and how they relate, and that historical stuff that I started with, is that it sometimes helps to not just accept the first theory that comes along because it fits, like the engineers and their 6 basic expressions, but to see whether maybe there can be some answers in there. For example, the relationship of subjective experience, physiology, and all of that. And think about it. Cannon, 100 years ago, challenged the Jamesian view that feelings and bodily responses were informative, because he said all emotions react the same. It's just arousal. Now we know that it's more than arousal, but it's not every emotion has its own pattern. So what is it? Well, this is the point when we have to talk to the psychophysiologists and get some psychophysiologists on board and see whether they can help.
Yeah. Okay. Arvid, thanks a lot for this this really insightful talk, and it's a pleasure. At the last minute, I'll use a couple of announcements and the sponsors. First is the announcements. Next week, we don't have a meeting, June 10, because almost all of us will be at Oerol, a theater festival, where we're running a really big study, which we hopefully we'll be able to present some stuff in the fall. June 17th, we have Flavio Azevedo, who will give a talk titled Measuring Ideology, Current Practices, Its Consequences and Recommendations. And then on June 24th, we have our own Christian Pipal with a talk titled They All Sound the Same, Rhetoric Change and the Influence in Parliamentary Speeches. And Luca Verstegen from Gothenburg University, We Love, They Hate, How Radical Right Voters Use Emotion Narratives to Consolidate Effective Polarization. That's on June 24th. That is also our last meeting before we all go on a well-deserved summer break. Arvid, maybe as last, you definitely deserve a mug that I don't have here. Maybe Isabella, you can wave it from the back, and we will get it to you at some point.
Oh, great.
And I also want to thank our sponsors, the ERC, the University of Amsterdam, the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, and of course the Association for Politics and the Life Sciences. Well, thank you for your attention today. Arvid, thanks for the excellent talk. The invitation to join some ideas to work with multiple labs, I think that we should definitely discuss at some point. That would be fun, and hope to see you all soon again. Okay.
Thanks, Bert. Okay, bye.
Thank you.